Ales coming right up. Hello, and welcome to the BRB. Please, have a seat. You're just in time for Tavern chatter.
Which is worse, a railroading DM or a complete Sandbox DM?
Sandbox.
Actually agree.
Hands down.
Have you met our indecisive motherfuckers?
Because at least railroading tells a story. Sandboxing, if it's too loose, you cannot tell a story with that. That is just a series of events, but not a narrative.
But at the same time, a Sandbox campaign doesn't necessarily need to tell a story other than just the story of what the adventurers want to do. If they want to turn it into running around, starting up a bar, going through to get alcohol for it and getting their liquor license for it and all these other activities, that can be their story.
I would say the reason why Sandbox, in my mind, is better, it allows the player's creativity to shape the adventure. It's not up to what someone else has decided for them, and when it comes to what the DM has in mind for whenever a player wants to go off on their own little adventure, it's a level of freedom and creativity that you can't really get to in a campaign that's pushing you towards a goal.
I agree that Sandbox is better. It does require the DM to be a lot more prepared because there's a lot more scenarios that could come up. So that does leave more on the DM to prep ahead of time.
Depends on my expectation of the campaign. If I'm looking into a campaign to where my character's decisions actually make a big impact, then a 100% railroaded campaign will get me nowhere. Now, if you are playing a campaign with the expectation that there's going to be a story with occasional combat, and that story is driven no matter what you do and how you do it, it would make sense. War games actually are based off of just that.
The biggest thing for me is with a Sandbox campaign, you either have to have motivated players that have a story that they want to have in mind. The DM needs to be working with the players to figure out what their backstory is to add into the world, so it's not just you're dropped into this world that you don't know. Instead, it should be a world that you're crafting along with. Your backstory should have a play in that. But at the same time, I think that the world should be able to play on without the characters.
Neither of them are good for a D&D setting. There are other things that you can play or do that are much better with sort of going with the railroad or the Sandbox concept. So you should always shoot for middle ground. Here's the question. Is it a successful DM or are they doing their job badly? Is that a variable we want to introduce, or are we going to assume that they're both equal level DMs?
That sounds argumentative.
Let's assume
that both DMs are good.
They are
both
successful
DMs are good.
in running a Sandbox game, like Eric was saying, is infinitely more complex than running a predetermined story. You have to be more prepared. There's way more things that can trip you up. There's way more preparation that goes into that. It's a volume of extra work that I don't think outweighs the benefits of a fully custom story. The railroaded one, in contrast, has less chances for error. Everything is predetermined, aside from attack rolls and whatever. Everything is predetermined. There's minimal room for failure, and you can guarantee every time that the DM is going to be prepared, going to be ready for a session, and won't miss that session due to unpreparedness.
I don't actually think the DM needs to be quote-unquote prepared. A good DM for a Sandbox style of game should be able to more or less improv, being able to think on their feet and change things up as they go. Yes, they might have a story in mind, or they might have the world that's going, but they don't necessarily need to have everything prepared.
You have been in a game that was no prepared, all improvised. You should know firsthand how this goes, both good and bad.
Right, and so assuming that both the Sandbox DM and the Railroad DM are good DMs, I think that the Sandbox is better if their ability to improv is good enough.
I don't think that improvisation is all that makes D&D passable. You have to have some skeleton to build your nonsense on. There has to be some preparedness.
Maybe theory, but I feel like that just being able to come up with a plot on the fly. The players decide to go on to the next town. What is the next town? Oh, crap, I don't know. You know what? A farming town, their main export is sugarcane, so based on that, they're going to just working all that in as you are going. Maybe you have a skeleton party somewhat in place, where you have a couple of towns ready, but you're not necessarily placing them in the world yet. You don't have a set place for everything and a set schedule for everything. If the players decide to never go on to the next town and looking for a town, then you don't use that. Maybe instead it was a dragon's lair up there. Who knows? With the proper ability to improv that sort of scenario, I think is good enough to let a party just go and do what they want and make their own story.
I think it comes down to what Brant was saying earlier about being able to make your own choices and your choices affect the future events and stuff. I don't like that. I've never liked that in a game, whether it be tabletop or a video game. Number one, the finality of every decision. And number two, there's a difference between knowing that your actions cause something in the future and then being directly linked. I don't like that. I don't like that uncertainty. I don't like that lack of transparency.
Going off of the idea that every final decision you make influencing the game, that should in some way excite you because it allows you to make your mark or impression on it. It's your ability to have your character express themselves throughout this world and to create a statement or its own story branching into what has already been created or is currently being improvised. If you wanted to play Dungeons & Dragons, you're kind of signing yourself up to play a story. In some other sense of games that can be played that are tabletop or role played that don't have those things, if you're avoiding that in Dungeons & Dragons, I don't think Dungeons & Dragons is the game for you. If you're going to play either Railroad or Sandbox, either or, you should know that the decisions you are making will affect the story.
I agree with you on all of that. Your decisions will always affect the story, and that playing those games signs you up for that decision. I get that, and D&D itself only bothers me in that way when it's a sandbox. If your decisions affect an outcome in the future, but it's one of 5 possible outcomes in the future, that's different than everything you do building on top of itself to create an entirely unique. It's the unknown and the random for it that I don't like, I think. But a lot of it comes to those kinds of choices in video games. Those have been something I despise in every game that I've ever played that has them. There are games that are based around that I don't like. I don't know. It's just a personal pet peeve of mine.
D&D should be always a mixture of the two. But if I were to choose one or the other as a player who actually experienced both a 100% railroaded campaign and a 100% just free roam style campaign, I prefer the free one. Even though it is completely random, some things may have been forgotten just because of how lucrative it was all at that time. But I just feel more engaged in that, whereas the story is just a person telling you the story. You're just there around to do it.
It helps make the world feel like it's living around you, not
Yes.
just that you're there to watch it.
Yes. I'd rather not be in a story time. I'd rather be actually in the story where my decisions matter.
But you can do that with a railroaded one too. If it is written to be that way and it is a good campaign, it feels like that. A real clarification that I should make. I like the idea of DMs giving you multiple options to choose from. I don't like true free choice with no restrictions and no paths to follow. It's the difference of if you're told you are put in a tavern, there's a board over here posting listings of, help wanted sort of thing. You can choose one versus you're in a bar. End of sentence.
I would be terrified to play a game like that with a DM like that. Sandbox campaigns do have storylines. Normally, the idea that you have in your head of a sandbox campaign is literally just the DM sitting the players down in one area and just going, go, make story. In most circumstances, and I'm not going to say this because there's always the variables in the world. However, in most circumstances, there is a starting point. There's always, most campaigns, no matter where they're built, how they're done, sandbox, railroad, book, homebrew, have an adventure hook. And that can be found in your Dungeon Master's Guide. You kind of always have to start the story there. There's always the jumping off point to get the ball rolling. Going forward from there, Railroad's just going to take you along a pre-written story and this goes back to where you were saying the world revolving in a railroad. It doesn't. The idealism of a railroaded campaign is that no matter what actions you take, the story continues along. It's not decision. Like, you can make decisions, and you could play a railroad 4 different times and have a different outcome for the most part every time. But how you get to the beginning of the story to the end of the story will always be the same. There's always, this is how it starts, this is how it ends. Changing that is what makes it a sandbox. You start here with your railroad, and instead of beating the big bad, you become best friends with the big bad, and then you guys go off on an adventure on your own. That's literally a sandbox right there. That's all that changes. It is the freedom to make a choice to have a different ending.
A couple quick things. Just because you have a predetermined start point and end point doesn't mean that the points in between can't exist without you. You have a path that you travel through this stretch of time. Everyone else is also traveling through that.
You like the sandbox version.
You can have a start point that never changes and an end point that never changes, with the world constantly in flux in between. The world lives around you between those 2 points. It's not infinite in all directions, but it's infinite for that timeline.
I have an example of both. One of them was a player ended up with lycanthropy, and that ended up completely changing the story. It went from, let's save this town, to, oh crap, we need to figure out how to cure the lycanthropy. Where in another game, we had a player get inflicted with vampirism. The story continued on. That never became a focus of the story. That just happened to the player, and they moved on. There was no offshoot, there was no ability to change the direction. This is going to happen one way or another. You are going to have these consequences. Versus the lycanthropy, where maybe the town does go down, a burning ball of fire. We're off doing something else. And just being able to pick up and move on, to me, is the difference between a railroad campaign and a sandbox campaign. Both still have a starting point, both still have an event that changed the party, just a matter of whether that event can actually make a difference.
Alright, it's closing time. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. If you like what you see, like and subscribe. Hit that bell icon to stay up to date. If you want to see more of us, check out the links to our social media in the description below. If you have any suggestions about our next video, please leave a comment as well.